got multiple roots. I'm sure you'll be telling us a little bit more about that, but certainly grew up in Abu Dhabi, born in Venice, not on a gondola, I imagine. No. Yeah. Editor of Poetry London, and has flown up this morning. Yeah, so especially to be here with us today. And yeah, we will be hearing some of his work also from High Desert, which is absolutely beautiful book that I have been enjoying over the last few days. Also, right next to me on the yellow fluff, we have Niall Moorjani, who is a wonderful, wonderful theatre maker, storyteller, who currently has 3 shows. I was very, very impressed with 3 shows in the festival this year, because you need a lot of energy to do that. So a beautiful children's show at the Storytelling Centre, The Girl and the Dragon. Also a story, Mohan, which I'm sure they'll be talking about later on, and a fairy tale. And grew up far away from the ancient town of Edinburgh, in more glamorous location of Dundee. Yeah. So we shall be hearing about their roots. But yes, please can we give them a big round of applause? Yeah. Welcome. Yeah. And my name is Mara, so if you have any questions also at all, this is a conversation, so if there is something burning in you at any point, we don't have to wait until the end. Please just let us know, and we'd love to hear from you as well. But this afternoon, we are going to be having a wonderful conversation about stories. What a lovely way to spend an afternoon. And just talking about how stories have impacted us, and how well, it would be interesting to hear your journey first of all, in terms of how you've started to work with words in the first place. So maybe we could start with you, Niall.
Hello. So yeah, I grew up in Dundee. I'd love to be like, I was deeply connected, because Scotland obviously has this amazing heritage of like storytelling and connection to it. I definitely did not grow up with that at all, but it's the classic thing of my mum would read to us all the time, especially if we were in the baths. She'd read us like Lord of the Rings, even though we were 6 and couldn't understand it, and grew up just loving fantasy and fantastical tales and myths and fairy tales especially. And then got a job in Edinburgh as a tour guide, doing ghost tours, which was tremendously fun, chatting absolute nonsense for like enough of a living while I was a student, which looking back on it was a tremendous job to have as a student. And essentially like realised that what you were doing like as a tour guide was storytelling, and some of the people who worked there were professional storytellers, and it was amazing. And I was like, great. It'll never be a job though, because it can't be, because you can't make a living out of just telling stories. But kept absolutely loving it, and started to write my own stories. It's the like feeling like you could take the sort of style of what you were working with and be like, oh, I'll do my own thing with that and make them whimsical and fantastical and soppy, as opposed to ghostly and haunted. And yeah, from that point kept going, and now we've got very lucky to get a show here. I was at Lighthouse, so it's always so lovely. It's like a little homecoming. Lighthouse took a big punt on me and went, you're doing some sweet fantastical bedtime stories for grown-ups, sounds weird but come, like, and did that. And then because of that I got a job at a children's storytelling centre in London called Discover, met a load of amazing storytellers and theatre makers through that, and then it's just you haven't stopped talking. I think that's the key with being a story. You ultimately keep talking until, well, somebody says that's been an hour, please leave the stage. Yeah, it's been sort of developing more and more work. The more I've done, the more personal it's become. And yeah, it's been a really fun, interesting. It's the thing, you don't really think about it while it's happening. You're just desperately trying to get the next thing, or the next paycheck. The paychecks are very useful. But like, yeah, it's amazing when you sort of think that I never thought I'd be doing this full-time, like I'd be a full-time storyteller, artist and like writer. I just didn't think that would happen. I always thought I'd end up in like tourism or academia or something, both amazing spaces to be, but I never thought it'd be storytelling.
Yeah, storytelling is not really something that your guidance teachers give you as an option at school. But yeah, it's just an amazing way of expressing yourself in words. But do you consider yourself a storyteller at all?
Yeah, I think so, really. I mean, I think like you said earlier, when it comes to my family, I come from, and this is putting it quite simply, I guess, in many ways, but it's talking about the source of the stories. On my mother's side of the family, where there's a lot of economic migrants, and on my father's side of the family, a lot of political exiles. And I also grew up in a place where United Arab Emirates, where 9 out of 10 people are foreigners. A lot of them are short-termers. My family was not one of them. We were there for over 20 years, really, in different stages. And it's a place that I think was interesting to grow up in because everyone came from different parts of the world. A lot of people were from mixed backgrounds, like myself. And what was interesting to find out in that little microcosm of the planet was that people, whenever they leave the place where they're from or where they think they're from, they start coming up with these wildly ridiculous kind of myths and ideas about the places they left and the places they want to go to. And so, yeah, I think, I tend to write narrative poetry quite a bit, and I think that that's really where I still source a lot of my material from, coming from this sort of pluralistic kind of place where people don't really have that many rights. One of my dearest colleagues is the Indian novelist Deepak Unnikrishnan, and his first book is called Temporary People. And when I read that book for the first time, I thought that's exactly what we were there, temporary people. And so, especially the more short-term you are, the more fantastic the ideas about the place that you've been forced to leave, or that you desire to leave, maybe because things weren't working out for you financially or socially or personally. And so, I think we are myth makers as a species. We're a nomadic species and we're a myth making species. And I think I've always tried to talk about that in my work, really, more or less. So, yeah. And I think, regardless of the style that one adopts in their writing, or regardless of the genre they adopt, I think you're always basing it around myths. You're just relating them in a different way.
I'm just really interested in what you're talking about in terms of temporary people and this transient nature that we have, but there is also this idea of belonging, and that we have to be rooted in a place, and then if we're uprooted from this place, then it's a disaster, it's a tragedy, and it's somehow something that we always want to get back to. What are your thoughts on that? Like, have you ever felt that way, or yeah?
It was interesting in the sense that the reason I was born in Italy, because my parents actually got together in the UAE. They were unmarried at the time, and part of the reason that I was born in Venice is my mother couldn't give birth as an unmarried woman in Abu Dhabi, so she went back to her hometown, essentially, and gave birth to me there, and then, coincidentally, a few years later, we wound up back in the UAE. And I think what was interesting as well about that experience led to me becoming more aware, let's say, of my Italian side than my Iranian side, partly because my father was a communist activist in pre-revolutionary Iran. When 1979 happened, he was exiled. And I think, like a lot of exiles, he came to a point where he didn't really want to impart the language of his people to his children. Like, none of us speak Persian. And so I felt cut off from the culture, even though in the Emirates I was growing up across the Persian Gulf from Iran. And I think also in the studies I've done in terms of the literature I've read, you find that quite in general, let's say, when people have that kind of radical forced break with where they come from, they end up either shutting that side of themselves off forever, or coming up with these myths of what that place used to be that no longer matches with the reality of the place. So the exiles, for example, that I met through my father were people that had an idea of Iran that completely didn't match what the reality of the country is today. And because they weren't able to go back, it meant that these myths just got larger and larger and, more out of touch with reality. So I think partly, also when it comes to issues of belonging, there's a story I like to tell. So this is the right moment for it, I guess. And it's part of a project that I'm going to be working on in the future. But as some of you may know, in the 1970s, the king of Bhutan decided that it would be a good idea to try and measure a nation's worth, whatever the hell that means, in terms of gross national happiness rather than gross national product. Because why should we base our ideas of what we're worth on pure economic output? And unfortunately, even though that idea is, especially in the way I've just related it quite simplistically, sounds like quite a good idea. And unfortunately, as the history of civilization proves, good ideas often have horrible outcomes. Because in the 90s, 20 years later, what happens is that the Buddhist majority of that country decides, well, what's going to make us really happy as a population is to expel the Hindu Nepalese origin minority. So here you have a third of the country, more or less, ejected in the space of 5 years. So here's this idea of happiness, this narrative of what can make us happy, being used to horrible means. It's also a really complicated story because, just quickly, what happens is, in the 90s, this Hindu Nepalese minority gets expelled from Bhutan. They wind up in refugee camps in Nepal. And for some reason, because he was the very unlikely chief actor of this act of resettlement. George W. Bush, of all people, enters the equation and says, sure, we'll take most of them. And they airlifted about 200,000 people to the U.S. So now you will go to Vermont, Pennsylvania, California, Washington, Oregon, and you'll find Bhutanese Lhotshampa, the Hindu minority, running dairy farms, because that was largely their occupation in Bhutan. And this was, a deal basically arranged through the U.S. and the UN. So here's this beautiful idea of, let's focus on what makes life worthwhile in terms of happiness, rather than just basing it on productivity and economics. And here's this horrible outcome, because it was essentially one of the largest single acts of deportation in the history of the 20th century. And no one really talks about it. But of course, I think, we're also, unfortunately, always at a loss at which stories to tell, because there's so many to tell. And especially with that community, I think they haven't had the chance to talk about it yet. So, yeah.
And whose happiness is worth more, Indeed. So you were talking also, like, when you were talking, I'm just going to jump on what you were talking about, like people being taken from one place into another, so the Bhutanese being transported over to the United States and then settling and creating a new home for themselves. And I suppose their ideas of belonging might be very different to somebody who has perhaps been, has arrived in a country in a different way. But Niall, I'm interested in your story as well about, about being here in Scotland and your feelings, because you're also mixed heritage. So what is your background in terms of that, and how has that influenced your journey and your myth making as well, and your connection to a place? I don't know if you've ever lived outside Scotland in that sense, and how has that impacted your work?
So huge sort of resonance and overlap with what you're talking about, André, in terms of my grandpa's story and my grandparents' story of coming to Britain. They were refugees during the partitioning of India, and had to move from Sindh in the north down. My grandpa's family ended up in Delhi, my Dadima's family ended up in Mumbai. And they, in that moment, they lost everything. And they had my Dadima doesn't talk about it, so we don't really know what she experienced. But my grandpa, we were very privileged, as many survivors of partition don't really talk about their experiences, that he would sit and tell us these stories. And so I sort of forgot when I was initially talking about this, my grandpa was one of the first storytellers I really encountered in that way. But you don't really think of that as storytelling, but he was passing down a sort of oral history that I've become increasingly fascinated with. And my grandparents really were my connection to my South Asian heritage. We grew up in Dundee, which, for those of you who know Dundee, will know that there's about 8 people of colour. And no, there's a few more, but like, you really don't grow up particularly. It's a little more diverse now, but when I was growing up in the sort of early 2000s there, you're almost unaware of the fact that you're brown until racism starts. And it was interesting, like, racism started in like a very abrupt like conversation on a school bus where somebody just sort of thought it was funny to make a racist joke, and then that was it. It was like a switch had flipped, and that was everybody talking about it. And I felt more and more isolated from my Scottishness. It will sort of come across that I really don't sound like I'm from Dundee. And I never had, my parents are both from England. I never had a strong Scottish accent, but I think my capacity to lose that accent has always been rooted in the sense that because of that, I never really felt like I fit in Scotland. But then, as you were talking about my grandpa, never passed on Sindhi or Hindi to my dad because he didn't want him to be racially bullied and racialized for his language. So my dad didn't grow up speaking it. He understands it really well, but he doesn't speak Hindi or Sindhi. So he didn't pass those to us. And so you have this big disconnect from a culture that feels very important to you. And as racism became more prevalent in my life as a teenager, I mean, being a teenager is hard no matter who you are. And then you add this sort of layer to it. I felt more and more isolated and alienated from a sense of Scottishness because I didn't belong. The literal colour of my skin still frequently in Scotland gets used as a measuring stick for how Scottish I can or can't be. The sort of like, but surely you're not from here, surely you're from somewhere else when you say I'm from Dundee. And it's like, I was born in Arbroath. It doesn't get more Scottish than Arbroath, home of the Smoky. But that's a sort of very prevalent thing. But I think what that did, and I've only sort of recently become a bit more conscious of it, I projected into other spaces, as you often do, to try and find a sense of where you might belong. And I was obsessed with stories where the main character didn't feel like they fit where they were. And they ended up in this fantastical, amazing space. So I became obsessed with any sort of story where there is this mythical space where it is a bit more fluid and flexible. I became very interested in the Greek myths where everything's all over the place, and this again overlaps as well with gender. Like, it's only in the last few years I've worked out I'm non-binary, but that's something I will have definitely subconsciously been wrestling with and thinking about without the language to express it for much longer. And I now look back on it and think it's not surprising at all that I was so interested in these fantastical spaces where, as much as they had their own rules, their own logic systems, they were so profoundly different from the world I lived in. And outsiders, or people who would have been outsiders in this space, the space I was occupying, was suddenly like front and center. Or travellers got to go there and live out, you know, with fairy stories. You go and you have these amazing magical dances, and it's the most profoundly beautiful night of your life. And you come back, and it's been 7 years or whatever, but you had in that space a moment of feeling like this was it, this is where you get to belong. And so it's an act of imagination to try and imagine yourself out of where you are, and into that new space. And I think looking back on what I've been doing with stories for a long time, it has always been trying to, it's why I love fantasy so much, trying to imagine a space where I might fit in it, because I never felt like I did. And I now live in London, and I often get asked by very well-meaning Scots, like, if I find that hard, because London's very different from Scotland. And it is in so many ways. You don't have the sort of sense of community, the friendliness, the loveliness, but at the same time, there's an absolute joy to walking down the street, and if somebody was for some random reason to ask me where I was from, and I said Scotland, the question would never be to do with the colour of my skin, or at least hasn't ever been so far. And I accept massively that comes with a sort of the fact my skin is quite pale as well enables that to happen, particularly in a London context where you have so many more black people and people of colour and so many more mixed people. But still, it's so refreshing because it's just not what I grew up with. And similarly with gender non-conformity, there are so many more spaces where I feel very safe doing that. And as much as I'd love to say that that's been the case when I've come back home, it's not been. And I've still never worn a dress in Dundee for fear that it wouldn't be a safe thing to do. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe my fears are unfounded, but so it's in this odd sense of London, a place that should in lots of ways feel so alien, but because there are these gorgeous, there are just more people. So there are more people that look like you, ideas that resonate with you, their lived experiences overlap with yours. There's a sense of, even though it's this vast, sprawling city that feels so disconnected, I've managed to find a bit more sense of belonging there than I ever managed to find up in Dundee. A bit more in Edinburgh, with communities that places like Lighthouse sort of create and then are created around it and by gorgeous organisations like Fringe of Colour. But at the same time, never really necessarily feeling like you could be rooted here. You're always fishing for that and searching for it. And I'm not saying I've got there in London, but it's the closest I've felt so far. And it's interesting that stories are sort of like, or the work I've done has always matched up with that. Even though when I was 15, I obviously wasn't consciously like, this is so interesting. This must be to do with gender and race. It's a story about a cow that goes to space. Yes. But yeah, that's sort of how I think those things connect for me.
How fantasy can really reflect reality in so many different ways. Because I have the show Blood and Gold, which I think a couple of people have seen as well. But it's looking at the legacy of colonialism and slavery, and it's through myth and fantasy as well. And one of the reasons for that is because it does provide a third platform on which to stand. You're kind of not between these quite hardened ideologies, and it just gives you space to think and to breathe without being pinned into one particular corner. But yeah, what is the role of fantasy for you in terms of your work, and how you kind of bridge that gap between the imagining, the myth making, and the reality of the world that you live in? Because you also you're not in London, and you're not in Abu Dhabi, and you're not in Venice, you're somewhere else.
Yeah, fantasy. Perhaps I think the biggest fantasy that's filled my mind ever since I started writing was the desire to write confessionally and tell some notion of truth, because that's perhaps the biggest fantasy of all. There's this quote that I used in my first book, which was mostly a book about my family's life in the UAE and jumping between one promised land and the other. That's what it's called, the promised land. There's a quote that I used from André Naffis-Sahely, which was, "It's neither true nor false, it was lived." And I've always tried to live by that, in the sense that I think like a lot of poets, I've tried, especially the ones who adopt the narrative style, I've written confessionally about my own life, and sometimes that's not matched with other people's account of that reality. And it's something that I really had to take into account. And it's interesting how I decided to work around that notion as well with the second book, with High Desert, where essentially, for the past 8 years, I spent 12 years very happily living in the UK in various different parts. And then I met my partner about 8 years ago and moved to the US. And for work, we found ourselves in California not too long after. And this second book is largely about my time in California and uncovering the sort of hidden histories of the region. And one of the things I very quickly decided was that, unlike my first book, where essentially it was driven by the lyric eye and I wanted to tell stories from my own personal point of view and try and incorporate others. I mean, I think in my work I've always used reported speech, where I think I've been quite accurate there. I think perhaps that's the area where I've been most accurate, where I've reported speech that others have used and made it, look like that, put it in between quotes. When it came to the second book, what I decided to do was there was this hidden histories of California from the 1800s to the present day. And for the first time ever, I decided to write some found poems, where essentially I took the words of various historical figures from the Spanish colonial era up to the present, taken from their diaries, letters, autobiographies, in order to tell the history of the American Southwest, through those centuries, using their words. So it's basically like a historical gallery of these found poems where I let people basically tell the story in their own voice. And I set that up with then poems where instead it's my perspective and my ideas, and I wanted to create that contrast. But I think, that's probably the biggest fantasy that I've ever entertained, trying to put reality onto paper. It's never really quite worked out. I'm not quite sure it works out for anyone, no matter how dedicated you are.
Is the poem that you were talking about earlier, would you like to read that one or speak that
Sure.
one?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll the only preface I'll add, because it's pretty straightforward, unlike some of the other poems in the book, but the original title was What the Immigration Officer Told Me. Then I realized that sounded too much like Basil Bunting, so I decided to call it Welcome to America. And this is also in between quotes, because this did happen. Welcome to America. Let's start again from the top. Nothing you told me sounds true. I've looked at your passport, and there are too many stamps. What kind of man calls himself cosmopolitan? You're ruthless and dangerous. I've printed out your poems and essays, and I want an answer right now. What are you doing here? Love isn't a reason, and neither is wanderlust. Why would she want you? Can you make enough money? I like thrillers and mysteries and plots with a point. Look around you. We're filled to capacity. This country's too generous. Do you see that old man in the wheelchair? He's been here for days, and you'll be here longer. Nobody reads anymore anyways. I'm late for lunch as it is, and if it was up to me, I would send you straight back.
It's beautiful, but really sad at the same time that is an experience that so many people face on a daily basis.
I mean, yes, I also think I usually have gotten away with it pretty well for obvious reasons. I'm not going to spell them out because look at me. And it's getting worse, I mean, unfortunately, I think, part of the reason that, because, even though I left the UK 8 years ago, I have been coming back on a regular basis. And part of the reason I always enjoyed coming back was because I never really got screened that much, and that changed as of a couple of years ago. So, but I think in a way, having those experiences, I was detained a lot in back rooms at airports and kept over for a few days in cells, but it was in a sense a great experience because it allowed me to connect to people that I wouldn't otherwise have met, frankly, or whose stories I think needed to be told in that specific context. So, I mean, I think part of the reason I also wanted to put that in, because this book, I think, was largely written as my attempt to upset Californians, because within America, they have this idea of themselves as being infinitely progressive and far more open-minded and woke than anywhere else in America. And then when you get there, you realize that it's just another empty myth. And it's one that I particularly like to burst. And so, that worked pretty well. So also because that happened in California. So, I mean, recently the governor of California put out these ads in reaction to the overturning of Roe v. Wade and other policies, put out these ads going, people in Florida, they burn books there and they persecute people because of their background and orientation. Come to California where things are fine. It's like California is mostly on fire most of the time. A lot of people are homeless, a lot of addiction issues. There's the biggest wealth divide that you'll find in the States. So, I don't know. I'm not sure you should listen to, Governor Gavin Newsom. I think I put out a different ad, but yeah.
I don't know if you should listen to anybody, really. I mean, there's the stories that are being told all over the world right now, yeah. And I imagine it's probably quite similar in London as well, where you live, in terms of, the image that we want to give of ourselves. Because I think we can speak about diversity in lots of ways, but do you find that, like living somewhere like London, for example, you were talking about the sense of belonging, you find your community, you build your, the people that who I suppose you feel safe with, or a sense of support. Do you need that, do you think? I'm just wondering in terms of the way that I would approach things, because sometimes I feel that maybe I want to rebel against how other people are feeling, because sometimes I feel that you need to belong to a particular community and you cannot step outside the thinking of that particular community. And if you do, then you might be you not necessarily ostracized, or maybe ostracized, but I just wonder, does belonging to a particular community, does that limit you in any way?
I think the desire to belong to particular communities has allowed me to take internalized narratives of sort of, for lack of a better term, self-hatred, and confirm them. So like in growing up very divorced from other black people and people, or black people and people of color, and that sense of what it is to share in experiencing racism, I never got that. Like, I was having a chat with a friend who I went to school with, and she's brown, and we were talking about how we didn't know what we were experiencing was racism. We just saw it as like everyday conversation, like it's the casual racism thing. And it's only now that we can actually have a conversation about it, like over 10 years after we've left school, or 10 years after we've left school. And that feels really weird. So when I started to realize that you could have that you could sit with somebody else who might be able to share and sit with you in that, and you could share those stories and sort of hold them together, rather than holding them all by yourself, you could hold them together. I was desperate for it, but then being disconnected from South Asian culture in quite a profound way, having grown up in Dundee, and my dad worked away a lot, like it was to provide for us, but at the same time it meant he wasn't really there. So like my biggest connection to brownness, him, wasn't a presence in my house very often. So it's this, and he has his own complex relationship with what it is to be Indian and to be brown in the UK. So when I realised you could have that, or it might happen, I was so desperate for it, but I was terrified because I didn't really understand what that meant, that I would do something wrong and then would be told that I wasn't welcome there either, which isn't actually true to the experiences I've had. If you go on the internet, you can prove that to yourself, but I think you can prove anything to yourself that you want to believe on the internet. And so I have found a really big sense of, like, I guess just help of like sharing in those spaces with people that can resonate with those stories. But in terms of finding a community that you belong to, it's just people that you trust and love, isn't it, a lot of the time, and those are the people, and they will frequently come from any background at all. It's not really just about if you try to put it into boxes, and I appreciate for some people that's exactly what they have to do. They don't feel safe with those that don't fit the spaces that they need them to fit in. But in my own personal lived experience, I've just found love from the people I've found love from, and you obviously want to keep them in your life. But I have found, since working out I was non-binary, the people I have met whilst exploring that and learning more about myself within that and sharing in those stories, because the concept of being non-binary is so vast, like, it's frequently getting sort of misrepresented in media or amongst circles who don't get it as a third gender and a third it's just this giant thing that isn't binary, it isn't fixed, it is just something floating. There seems to be, at least amongst those that I've spoken to in the literature I've read, a sort of an idea that no one person's experience can define this, and so there kind of can't be a party line on what it is to be that, and everybody's individual interpretation of their gender in that sense is just as important as the next person's, which is gorgeous, and it's so lovely, and almost sharing in this space of going, we all get it but we also don't, because everybody's got a different experience of this, and obviously your race, your class impact the way you experience the world in those senses as well, but we can also share so much. feels really liberating and lovely. And so you get this sense of community without feeling like your individuality is taken away. And again, so much of it, as we are here to talk about stories, is storytelling and sharing those stories with each other. Some of them are particularly hard to share. Some of them are beautiful. Like my friends Mo and Mo's wonderful partner Marta was talking about how, like, you know, non-binary people, in terms of dirty talk, it's really hard for us because you've got, like, you know, somebody can be a naughty boy or a bad girl, but if a non-binary person, they're a bad person. And that's just like, I've stolen that joke straight out of their mouths, so I can take no credit for it, but it cracked me up, and like, that's gorgeous. Like, and so it doesn't always have to be pain, it can be sharing in that joy, like, and in sharing in those stories. I think it's because outside of my family and my close friends, in a sort of wider sense of what is it to feel like having a community. I don't think I've ever had that, and it's the closest I've ever felt to having it. And so, yeah, I guess I don't feel there's any need to rebel against it in that space. But when anybody tries to tell you that if you are doing it wrong, you're like, well, what the heck are you on about? I am the thing. But I've been very lucky that so far in my life, the spaces I have sought out and have been welcomed into have generally been very welcoming of me.
And earlier, when we were having a conversation as well about the shows that you were creating, and it was lovely because you were saying you were this vessel for these stories to come through as well. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, just kind of basically following in from what you're saying as well?
I guess to completely come back to what you were saying about putting reality into like writing is myth-making in itself. My grandpa's story, the one that's a show called Mohana Partition Story on the Storytelling Centre, is me trying to recount his experiences as a refugee during partition. And it's like been such a profoundly challenging show to put together because there's so much decision making to make. Like 12 million people were uprooted, 3 million people died, and then this isn't my story, this is his story. And I'm trying to, and it's my family's story as well. I don't have ownership over it in the way that if I was talking about something I'd experienced, I would. So there were a lot of, like, you know, craft choices to make, like the professional decisions to make around how do I best do this? Do I really try and perform it in like a big performance piece? And there are such traumatic moments and emotional moments, but that felt really wrong to me. I felt like all I wanted to do was try and get the story out, because in terms of talking about the partitioning of India, it's been, you know, 75 years of Fringe, and it's also 75 years of partition, and many people in this audience might know that, but broadly across Scotland and more widely the UK, nobody knows. If you mention it to them, they're sort of like, oh yeah, sort of vaguely know, but the depth of it, the vastness of it is something that's so alien to people's brains, and that's not people's faults. We've been forcibly made to forget the fact that Britain was involved in that. And I say Britain broadly because Scotland was very much a part of that moment, if that makes sense, within a British context. And like, so in trying to tell that story, I'm hoping to challenge those moments, but I'm also just trying to pass my grandpa's story on and let that impact people as I hope it impacted me, because I was just like, whoa, this little old dude who likes to ramble on about politicians being bloody idiots has lived through this seismic moment of history that I never hear about unless it's him telling me. So for me to sort of get in the way of that and think like, oh, I'm an amazing performer who does tremendous jokes sometimes, and, you know, if I want you to cry, I'll make you cry kind of thing, felt really wrong, because that's not what he was. He was a little old man recounting his experiences, and so I made the decision to try and take myself out of that and to, like, it feels very pretentious saying it in front of an audience, to be a vessel for just passing that story on. And I hope if somebody came to watch it, that they would feel like they hadn't necessarily, like, I do some contextualizing as myself, but in terms of his story, that they'd have felt like they'd sort of watched my grandpa talking about his experiences. But then, of course, I'm making artistic choices when I do that. I stop at moments for dramatic tension in the hope to try and bring the emotion of that moment up a little bit. And then memory's a funny thing. Like, memory, as you say, this is how I lived it, but that really didn't work for other people who lived the same moment. His memories that he shared with me and my dad differ. Like, the best example I've got is he came over in '63 on a boat, and he had £3 when he was on this boat. And this guy on the boat, he gave £2 of those pounds to. Now, my dad believes that my grandpa gave him those £2. Also, just for context, how wild is it that immigrants were only allowed to come with £3 in the '60s? Like, nuts. It's incredible for any of them that have, like, you know, just managed to survive that space. It's just exceptional. But then he gave 2 away to this guy, and for my dad, it's because this guy was really nervous and struggling and anxious and shaking and didn't think he was going to be okay. And my grandpa was a cocky bastard in lots of ways. Like, he was like, I reckon I've got this. You can have 2 of my pounds. And he really had a profound sense of self-belief. But when Grandpa told me that story, it's because the guy wanted to see the pyramids of Giza. And the guy was just like, it's been a lifelong dream to see the pyramids. And my grandpa was like, you know what? If it's your dream, I'll make it happen. And so Grandpa came to the country with not 3, but 1 pound in his pocket. But for me and my dad, that's a different story, if that makes sense. And who knows? Maybe one of us is misinterpreted. Maybe my grandpa had multiple different versions of the same thing. And even with his trauma, and the more traumatic events, there are certain things that he never told me until the last time I spoke to him, which was just before he passed. He told me about watching this horrific sounding event where he watched people murdered in front of his own eyes. And he'd never told me that before. And he'd never told my dad that. And I don't know if he was getting older. Was he starting to conflate moments from other people's experiences with his own? Or was he just revealing what had happened to him and he'd never felt like he could share before? We'll never know. And memory's such a funny thing. And so when you try and take people's truth, which of course there is such a truth to what he went through, because even if those things didn't happen to him, that story is still so true for so many people who lived through partition. So it's so hard, because you're like, well, I don't know exactly which one's true. In lots of ways they all are, and then they aren't. But for 12 million Indians that went through it, it's something, or 12 million Indians and Pakistani people who went through it, it's something that is deeply true. And in telling the story, those who have come and spoken to me after, there's been such a deep resonance that it's like, it doesn't really matter, how true or not true it would be specifically for him. Maybe he wouldn't have even known. He was 11 is the other thing. It's so hard. But to just not tell those stories at all because you're getting a bit worried about whether exact details followed exactly feels so wrong as well. And there feels like, whilst not knowing whether something is 100% true, it would be really counterproductive to not still share it as if it is, because it's clearly a truth for so many, and may well have been a truth for him as well. And to sort of run back where you were talking about, for me, as an artistic decision, I just didn't feel like I had a role in that beyond just passing it on, and keeping myself out of that story as a performer almost as much as I could was the right way to do that, just to try and pass that story on.
That so much of that resonated. And I think when you were speaking, I think in my work as storytelling, I've worked with different community groups as well. And I remember I was working on a project and it was with veterans. And I think one of the conversations was also about the skipping of generations, because if somebody has gone through such a traumatic experience, whatever that might be, then if you have a child, then your job is to protect that child. So it's you don't want to pass on the horror of whatever it is that you've lived through. However, when you become a grandparent, then it's not just an experience, it's a story that you're passing on. And like you say, whatever has happened, you can build on it in whatever way, or it does. It kind of gets mixed up with so many other things. And one of the greatest gifts that my mother gave to me was sort of telling me her stories. But she throws them out. I don't know if with the rest of you, throw them out like, oh, this is a story that happened to me when I was a kid, and you're like, oh my God, that has impacted me. And if anything had happened and I didn't know this story, then I would have no idea about my grandparents and how amazing they were. So it is really important to actually keep those connections. So, and André, also, I'm just kind of wondering with you, and your very, very complicated and expansive background as well culturally, do you think it's important to keep trying? Do you dig for some of those stories, like the personal stories?
Yeah, I think that's where most of my time goes, I think, digging into these stories. And I also wanted to say, I found your words beautiful, Niall, where you're talking about, I think, in terms of, first of all, I think also the one of the things, just your immediate last point that you just made before you passed the mic, which was this, the literature that we create around these events is, and I think we often forget this because we'd like to think that things work out differently. But here's the reality. That's often all we're going to have left. I find it interesting that, when it comes to the debate between history and myth, if you look back to the time of Babylonia, we have quite ample historical records from that period, given how far back in time it goes. However, where do we go in order to gain the sort of, let's say, the essential truth of what that period was like, epics like Gilgamesh. We don't go to the very minute records left behind in cuneiform. We go to the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I think, when it comes to partition as well, history fades into myth and gets politicized. So at a time when there's still a lot of tension in India, it's a country that, because, in the UAE, essentially, as I went to an Indian school, it's a country where 60% of the population come from the subcontinent, whether it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Sri Lanka. So I grew up within that context. So it was more of a subcontinent part of the world than an Arab country, really. And then, therefore, that let me go into the subcontinent quite often. And having been there, I've seen that it's still a source of intense debate, of intense struggle. And so the facts are going to get more and more warped as we go along. And so it's only when watching your show or reading a novel set during that time that we're actually able to gain some of the truth that might help us gain even a slight understanding of what that time was like. I also find that the question of ownership in stories is really quite an interesting one, because so much ego gets wrapped up within that. Something that's quite striking, that whenever I've met writers who, I think in a relatively old-fashioned way, including myself, you call yourself confessional, you're looking at people like Robert Lowell, where you're presenting such a stylized version of a moment that people do, if they're not careful, they do get seduced into thinking that really is reality as it happened, and it's an unquestionable record. And it's that unquestionable part of the record that we've all rightly become very uncomfortable with in this time. It was, I think, overdue. But so much ego gets wrapped up in that. Something I found with colleagues who work in that confessional vein, they've had problems with their own families where, whether it's their sister or their father or their grandfather has gone up to them, or has gone up to their agent or to the producer staging the play in the theater, going, "Oh, this is, it's a complete misrepresentation of what happened. My story is my own, and you don't get to steal it this way." Something interesting that's happened in all these stories that I've heard: if the book / play / poem is successful, those people then go, "Oh, it's successful? Well, that's about me then," and then they relinquish that ownership. And so I think that's actually quite interesting, really, because I think and I think the success here, it's not necessarily because they're egomaniacal, it's because they want their story communicated. And I think so long as they think that it's reaching people in a relatively positive way, then their objections tend to melt away. It's something that I've heard from various different writers who, again, work within that tradition. And so I think it's something that I think a lot of writers didn't think about enough in the past. When it comes to Robert Lowell, who I think these days is a deeply unfashionable writer, but I think a lot of things have been forgotten about him. One of the more interesting ones is when he came out with his book in 1959, Life Studies, which is seen as the source of confessional poetry. And of course it isn't. Other people have produced examples of work in that vein, but when it came out, he was presenting this upper class, because he was a Boston Brahmin, this upper class family where he was airing their dirty laundry, essentially. He was like, this is what it looks like when my parents argue. This is what it looks like when my grandfather belittles my mother, or my mother belittles my father. And the review, the famous review that came out in '59, basically, that invented the word confessional as we know it, because it was this critic that used it for the first time in the modern context. He actually accused Lowell for making his father seem unmanly, because he was portraying someone who was quite weak-willed, who was domineered by Lowell's mother. And so the question wasn't, are you telling the truth? The question was, what does it look like when the truth you are telling conflicts with our societal notions of what representation should look like? Because back then, there was this obsession on the nuclear family, on the so-called manliness of men. This Robert Lowell's father was also an admiral in the Navy. And so there was also this taboo that was being broken, because you're making this guy who's spent his whole life in the Navy, he was a rear admiral I think by the end, seem completely unmanned. And it really conflicted with the Moors at the time, because this was McCarthyite America, and this was also the first time that a writer that was so public was saying, I'm really messed up, my mind's not right, and I get therapy, which is something that I think is quite more commonplace these days, at least in certain parts of the world. So I think it's about the clash that you create. It's the oppositional stance that you take towards the society you're describing, because then the notion of how truthful you're being really fades away. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, in terms of what you're saying, like how the truth of the story and how it disrupts society, but then it creates a brand new society in many different ways as well. You can shatter everything, but then at the same time it builds. So there's such huge power and value in stories. Do you think that people appreciate that enough?
I just find the idea of stories' capacity to create something new so exciting. Like it's the thing that the more and more I do it, I'm working with them, both written and performed. Like this notion that you can use a story both as a mirror, but also as an example. Like you can use it to hold up a mirror to society and point out its flaws and or what you believe its flaws to be and the problems with that. And you can almost trick people into going, like, say you want somebody who's not non-binary to like come with you on a story about that. You can start it in a very sort of normative way and then slip it. I kind of do it in the one I'm doing here, a fairy tale. It starts fairly normative and then slides into this, you get whisked away to fairy, like the most obviously queer space that was never overtly called queer, like kind of thing. And you can bring them with you into that. So you can not only give an example of like a criticism, but you can give criticism, hold a mirror up to like the pains and the flaws of what you perceive those things to be, but then also be like, here's how it could be, here's how life could look. And again, coming back to fantasy or any kind of fantasy, be that traditionalist fantasy like Lord of the Rings, often a different world, or a fantasy in our own world, because they all kind of are, aren't they? You can say this is what it could be like. You can write stories where the main character is like gay, and instead of like so many of those stories, not that it's not super important to explore the pain that communities who have been marginalised have gone through, but in this fantastical landscape, that's not their problem. They've not got enough beans and they need to get more beans, and until they get more beans, like, they're just not going to have enough beans. But the fact, as they go through this story, the fact that they're gay is just a thing that's about them. It's lovely, they've got a wife and they're very happy with their wife, and nobody's going to go like, the reason you're not getting more beans is because you've got a wife. It could be like, you don't tell good enough jokes. And like, I think there's a real joy to like creating that space where you've said like, no, I'm choosing to live in a universe just for a little moment where that thing that obviously in our current society is still so hard to be and is so fraught with danger and marginalisation and oppression. Actually, what could the world look like without it? And sure, you could do it with things probably more inventive than beans, but I just think there's such a like excitement to be able to play in that and to sit in those spaces. And stories have kind of always done both of those things. They've both mirrored and set examples, like when they're the oldest form of history in loads of ways, and communicating ideas. And this way, like so many of like the folk tales I'm sure we all grew up with, we're passing on ideas of how the world should be. And sure, you could take some and go, well, that's kind of messed up, like I don't think I'll be inheriting that. But like Boy Who Cried Wolf, a classic, like really easy learning objectives in that, like don't, because you'll get yourself into mischief eventually. Like and I think we can learn so much from that tradition, obviously choosing to acknowledge or leave behind the more problematic elements of it, but then also work in the space of like, what could a traditional feeling story or a story, and that, I mean, that, as you were saying, we're always kind of using myth. Where can that take us? How can that show us the way? And I find that so exciting. You obviously need the ones that are overtly critical and are choosing to tell the stories that haven't been told, but ones that hold up new imagined stories are so exciting too for me.
I think there's this wonderful quote from Wole Soyinka, and he says that a tiger does not announce its tigritude, it merely pounces. And I feel that's very much what you're doing. You tell your story, and then that's it. There's no need to explain anything or push a message or anything. It's just, this is how things are, and that's it. There's no need to do anything else. I know we've got a few minutes, and I've forgotten to ask questions. So if there is anybody who does have a question for... Yeah.
No, we can start with the online ones then.
Yeah.
There we go. So we've got a question from someone called Kay. Lots of people, and rabbit ears are in the tell stories. How do you, all three of you, differentiate between that and your storytelling?
repeat the question again, please.
Lots of people tell stories. How do you differentiate between that and your story?
I guess for me, I don't know how you two feel about it, the main thing for me is time. Like, of course, we are all storytellers all of the time. We're all spending our lives telling each other stories. It's how we communicate. It's like, how was your day? I went to the shops, like, I saw this thing, there was a cute dog. Well, we've told that story. But when you're telling a story, I don't know if it be it for page or be it for stage, like, I feel for me, the main thing is the time I've put into it. And sometimes that might be as little as going, sure, that'll work. Like, and it's like, here's an idea, might as well give it a bash, but I've taken the time to, instead of just communicating what's coming into my head immediately, there's been a thought process of how do I get this story with whatever narrative it's got across the best I can, and sometimes I'll put more time into that than not. So like for a Fringe show, you've probably spent hours and hours and hours on it. Some people haven't. I resent them so much. But there's been a huge amount of time and effort, and I imagine you spend a lot of time crafting your poetry and thinking about which words to use and when. And so for me, that's definitely it. And thinking, like, when I'm just recounting a story to my friends, I'm not thinking like, what's going to get the biggest laugh? Like, if I pause for 3 beats, will it really work? Like, I'm just telling the story, whereas on stage it's definitely a lot more about like considering those artistic choices that allow you to hopefully get the best reactions for the different moments in the story. The different beats of the story are put out clearly. So for me, that would be the answer to that question. I don't know.
That's a great answer, and it's also a really great question. So yeah, thanks to Kay, I think, for the question, because that's a really good one and not an easy one. I mean, I feel like when it comes to one of the things I think I should lead with is, and we've had more clarity about this at different times in history, but every generation tends to think it's on the edge of the precipice that no other generation has faced. Every generation tends to think that it has elements of originality that no other generation has experienced before. It's quite striking. I think one of the best decisions I ever made, I dropped out of school when I was 15 because the education I was getting in the Emirates was appalling. And one of the best decisions I made at the time was to read a lot of Greek and Roman classics. And if you look at what they were talking about and how they were talking about it, and you match it up with the most radical poetry being written today, the similarities are quite striking. So again, there's this idea that you're always the first to voice certain stories, and it's another of the great myths that fuel storytelling, because that's just not true. We'd like to think that it's true, but it's not. So how do I voice stories any differently from no one else? I don't think I do. I don't think I necessarily do that. I think being alert to that question is what fuels the work, which is why, with the first book, because there's always this idea, especially as a poet, that you want to make your mark in some way, and you have all these idiotic ideas about how you want to do it, and you'd like to be as original as possible. With the second book, that's why I put together this sequence of found poems, because I was interested in the idea of other voices, because I didn't think that what I was relating and the style in which I was relating it was any less interesting than theirs, frankly. And I think also these days, and I think it's been a very important but necessary debate. I think earlier we were talking about, the ownership of stories, right? Both of us in different ways. And I think something that's gotten lost in the important debate around, what has been, I think, misleadingly called a lot of times cultural appropriation, is that a lot of communities don't necessarily mind written about. They just want it to be written about with a certain kind of understanding and respect, and be given the space to tell their own stories. Because it's something that I often tell students whenever I've got the luck to teach classes, is that I think as a writer, and I think you said this earlier, Niall, and I was really quite pleased that you did, is as a writer, you have to have the courage to handle certain stories that you may not be the most adept person to tell. But I think the approach that you put into that, the philosophy, the ideas, the act of actually meeting people, I think is undervalued. I think what's been rightly criticized is people essentially, yes, appropriating stories that they made no effort whatsoever to get to grips with. And that, I think, is a practice that, should be eliminated entirely. But that's just sloppy writing, and sloppy writing has existed so long as we've had, stone to carve things on or paper to write things on. So I think that's really the heart of the writer's task, to be able to handle a story that lies outside of yourself, but you're trying to tell it in a way that really underscores our shared humanity. And I know that sounds grandiose, but it is what fuels, I think, a work's worth.
I think we need a whole other conversation on cultural appropriation. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, just quickly in response to that question, the way I would approach it also is it's in terms of the way I craft a story. There's certainly an intentionality there because we are all at different stages in this life's journey, and I never know who's going to be in an audience. So when I am researching and crafting, I do, just outside of that, I do things like I read the Daily Mail, but I'm not a Daily Mail reader, because it's important for me to understand actually a much wider grasp of what other people are thinking, and just to understand a greater landscape of where we are, because that is certainly going to be impacted by the stories that I tell, or I don't know who's going to be in the audience, but I don't want to alienate people. My job is to engage people in the story because I know that I'm planting seeds. I don't think anyone is going to get the message that I'm trying to tell immediately, but certainly it's the crafting of the story is very intentional in that I know what I want to say, but I also understand that there is a multitude of different people in the room, and how am I going to hit every single person in that particular space. So that is how I would approach the crafting of a story, which if we're in a living room having a chat, then there's probably not, like you say, there's none of that. So yeah, everybody tells stories, but I tell stories very, very clearly. I have a very strong intention behind them. Yeah. I don't know how we
have time for one burning question.
One burning
because
question.
We're a little bit over time.
Yep.
So if you could bring the mic to Peach.
Hello. Sorry, I got head rushed because it's really hot. So how do you discover yourself through storytelling, and then conversely, or like at the same time, how do you keep yourself safe and secure when you're trying to tell the stories of other people or, larger?
Yeah, thank you. Another great question. Thank you. I think that the answer to that, I think, can vary from project to project. Speaking from personal experience, when I wrote my first book, I wrote it knowing that it was never going to be put on sale in the country that it's written about, or really discussed outside of a very small way. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. The UAE is a place there's tightly enforced censorship there. Ironically, I mean, it's topped by another writer who's also banned there. So there's the sense in which you can teach the work because there's a certain financial incentive to it. So it's taught at university, but it's not actually available on sale. I'll leave you all to figure out the twisted logic behind that, because it makes no sense whatsoever. Either ban it or don't properly, one way or the other. I think the question of self-preservation in terms of just myself, and I want to make this very crystal clear, doesn't really concern me that much, in the sense that I think when you put yourself in a position where you're wanting to tell certain stories, especially I think for political reasons, because I think one of the lines that really inspired me when I was younger was the Chilean poet Nicanor Parra, who said, "A poet has to be a thorn in society's side." And I remember reading that and thinking, that I want to do that. And so I think once you decide to take that stance, I think that the notion of self-preservation gets a little shaky. I think what matters is not taking too much for granted. Because earlier when I said, what is a writer without the act of trying to present realities that they themselves may not understand? What needs to be underscored with that is that if you're not actually going out there and making connections and seeing these people that you're writing about, then there's no point to doing it, because it is at heart an act of communication. So I think it's more about the preservation of others than the preservation of self, as far as I'm concerned.
How over time are we, Myri? Because if we're super over time, I think that was a lovely...
You're about 10 minutes.
I guess in a nutshell, I think it's really, for me, self-preservation, I really struggle with my own internal dialogue of feeling like I don't belong and I shouldn't be in certain spaces. So a lot of the time I find myself through stories, because especially fantastical spaces or traditional myths are safe places to project myself and try and work out those things. And then I think the most interesting thing I can add to this is the idea that I've learned so much about myself through stories that I've been writing without realizing that's what I was doing at the time. Like where I wrote a story about a selkie, which I now have tattooed on my arm, that was absolutely about being non-binary, but when I wrote it, I thought it was about being mixed race. And those two overlap massively for me. But when I first wrote it, I had no real idea, and it featured on Fringe of Colour films and things like that, but I thought it was about one thing. And then a few weeks later, I was like, oh, yeah, obviously. Like this thing that can take its skin off and walk in one guise and walk it and swim as another, and it's in this fluid space kind of, oh yeah, like of course it's that as well. And like I was super attached to writing stories with protagonists or important characters who were non-binary and had they them pronouns, and I was like, I'm just being a good ally. It's got nothing to do with me. Like, and then later realize, oh no, that's absolutely what I was trying to figure out. The story was ahead of me, so I definitely find myself in that. And in terms of keeping myself safe, a lot of the times it's like for the one with my grandpa, I really got myself in a spin with that. Like the ending was very confrontational and quite big, and for me quite angry. I felt awful doing that. As much as I believed everything I was saying, I felt really stressed about it. So the ending is now it's getting more angry again. Now I'm becoming more comfortable, but it's now a lot more sort of safe for me to perform. And then I had to remember that it's my grandpa's story I'm telling. Nobody else is, apart from my dad, is as connected to that story as I am. I'm not trying to tell every partition story when I tell that story. I'm just passing on my grandpa's story, and that's given me a lot of freedom in that sense. But I felt really unsafe when I thought I was trying to represent everybody at once, which you can't do. As you say, and this is again me speaking purely for myself. But I think it's really important, for me it's really important to take active steps to keep myself safe, or else my mental health does get in a bad space with it. But then when it goes well, it feels like the most gorgeous and liberating thing to do. I'll wrap that up there.
I'll just be super quick. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure actually. I guess there's this thing that we say with the storytellers is that the story finds us, and then we just kind of, we are the vessel, or I am, the vessel that the story comes through in terms of my work. With the keeping safe, I also don't take action to keep safe, I don't think, because the story just needs to be told, and I'm telling it and I have crafted it in a way that is the best of my ability. So there's nothing else that I can do above and beyond that. I'm also, I suppose, in a space just kind of being mixed race. When I grew up in Kenya, very, very privileged because I am mixed race. And then coming to Scotland, I had that. I kind of carried myself quite high, I think. So I guess my experience is, I have friends who are also Kenyan Scottish who have never lived in Kenya before, and so have not had that other experience of being viewed in a certain way. So I suppose when I would go back to Kenya, people would call me Mzungu, 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 which is white person, which used to piss me off because I never saw myself as that. And then in Scotland also, I was referred to as African. I never saw myself as an African because I was Kenyan, and so I always knew that people were putting different ideas on me that were not how I viewed myself. And I remember there was one point when I was being chased through the village, Mzungu, 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 and I thought, if I get angry every time, or annoyed or pissed off every time somebody refers to me as something, or sees me in the storytelling world as something where I don't see myself, then I'm just going to be annoyed all the time. So fuck it. I will just be me, and anybody else who has an opinion, that's kind of their problem. So that is how I approach things right now. I don't take anything personally. I really don't take anything personally. And so far it's working, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But anyway, just to say huge thank you. We'll wrap up now, but can we have a huge round of applause for Niall and André, and to yourselves as well at home. So thank you.
Before you get off the stage, would each of you just plug where people can see you next at the Fringe?
Okay, well, I have the mic. So Blood and Gold opens tomorrow at the Lyceum Studio, 6 p.m. until the 28th. Mondays and Tuesdays are off. So yeah, that's the show I was talking about earlier.
It's a tremendous show. I have seen You Should Go. I have 3 shows on. I have a kids show on at 10 a.m. called The Girl and the Dragon. That's at the Scottish Storytelling Centre, dealing with sort of themes of forced migration, but with dragons in a very children-friendly, accessible way. There's jokes and silliness and gorgeousness. That's with Vinnie Wilkinson over there, who's tremendously talented. I have Moorjani Partition Story, which I feel like I've talked about loads. That's on at 3 p.m. at the Scottish Storytelling Centre until the 16th. The Girl and the Dragon's on to the 21st. And then I have a fairy tale, which is here at Lighthouse, house. It's like a proper beautiful homecoming. I'm so excited. It's where I did my first ever show, and I hope I do shows here forever and ever and ever. That's on from the 18th to the 21st. It's about being whisked away to Elfland with sexy, queer, beautiful, non-white fairies doing exciting things with a cellist who's amazing called Diana Redgrave, and we'll be at that lighthouse at 8 p.m. from the 18th to the 21st. Thank you very much.
That's just it for today. So I'm here. I'm doing a reading at. Oh, there we go. I'm doing a reading tonight at Typewriter Books, launching High Desert. So I'm there tonight, and yeah, I'm leaving tomorrow. But yeah. So yeah, and there we go.